Hey everyone, and welcome back to English Listen and Learn. I'm Ben, and with me is Anna.
Hi, everyone.
Today, we're going to be tackling something that I know can be like a real pain point for English learners,
Yeah,
remembering and using new words.
it's true.
Yeah,
You put in the effort, you learn the words, but then just when you need them, poof, they disappear.
it can be so frustrating,
That's
right? You're in a conversation, you know what you want to say, but the words just don't come out.
Yeah,
Almost like your brain has decided to play a game of hide and seek at the worst possible moment,
precisely. And it's not just conversations. Think about presentations, meetings, even writing an email.
right?
Suddenly you hit a wall and that perfect word that, you've learned is just gone.
Okay, so we've established that forgetting words is a common experience.
Yeah.
But why does it happen? What's going on in our brains that makes it so difficult to hold on to these new words?
Well, one key factor is how our memory works. Our brains are wired to prioritize information we use regularly. If you only encounter a word a couple of times, your brain might not see it as important enough to store in long-term memory.
Oh, so it's not just us being forgetful. It's how our brains are designed.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we're stuck with this word amnesia. There are things we can do to overcome this, right?
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to explore today. We'll look at some of the reasons why we forget, and more importantly, we'll equip you with practical strategies to actually remember and use those new words with confidence.
That sounds great. So let's start by unpacking some of the common scenarios where word loss strikes. What are some of the situations where our listeners might find themselves struggling to recall the right words?
Well, picture this. You're
Right.
finally having a conversation with a native English speaker. You're excited, eager to put your knowledge into practice. But then, bam, your mind goes blank.
Oh, I can definitely relate to that. It's like stage fright, even
Yeah.
in a casual setting.
Exactly. And those feelings of pressure can be amplified in group situations.
Oh,
Presentations, meetings, social gatherings, suddenly you feel like your vocabulary has flown the coop.
and it's not just speaking right. Sometimes you're writing and you just can't seem to find the right word to express your thoughts. You know you've learned it, but it's like it's vanished into thin air.
Absolutely. It's almost as if our brains have two separate dictionaries, one for understanding and one for using.
Hmm.
And then there's the frustration of learning a new word, repeating it a few times, feeling confident, and then poof, it's gone the next day.
Ugh, I know that feeling all too well. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. You review, you repeat, but those words just don't seem to stick.
Right. And let's not forget those words you understand perfectly well when reading or listening, but you just can't seem to use them in your own speech or writing.
Right.
It's a common experience,
Hmm.
and it can be incredibly frustrating.
So we've identified a few of those relatable scenarios where word loss tends to strike,
Yeah.
but I think it's comforting to know that this is something almost everyone learning a new language experiences. It's not just us.
Exactly. And I think understanding why this happens can be really empowering for English learners. It takes away some of that self-doubt and allows us to start focusing on solutions. So let's delve into the reasons behind this word amnesia. It's not just about being forgetful. There's a real science to it.
That's right. Our brains are complex machines,
In.
and understanding how they work, especially when it comes to memory, can make a big difference in our language learning journey.
Absolutely. One key concept is something called active recall.
Okay.
It's the idea that we remember things better when we actively try to retrieve them from our memory, rather than just passively reviewing them.
So instead of just reading a list of words over and over again, we should be actively testing ourselves, trying to recall the words without looking.
Exactly. It forces your brain to work harder, and that effort strengthens the connections in your memory.
Okay.
Another important factor is the forgetting curve. This basically shows that we forget information over time if we don't actively review it.
So even if we manage to memorize a word initially,
Yeah.
if we don't use it, we're likely to forget it.
That's right. But here's the good news. Each time you revisit a word, the forgetting curve becomes less steep. So the more you practice and use a word, the longer it will stay in your memory.
That makes sense. It's like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Precisely. And just like building muscle requires consistent exercise, building vocabulary requires consistent practice.
Okay, so active recall and the forgetting curve are important factors.
Oh.
What else plays a role in why we sometimes struggle to remember words?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, our brains thrive on connections. When we learn new information in isolation, it's harder for our brains to store it effectively.
So just memorizing words from a list without any context might not be the most effective strategy.
Exactly. Our brains remember things better when we can connect them to real-life situations, images, emotions, anything that creates a meaningful association.
So instead of just trying to cram a word into our memory, we need to weave it into our understanding of the world around us.
That's a great way to put it. For example, let's say you're learning the word exquisite. Instead of just memorizing the definition, you might imagine an exquisite piece of art you've seen, or a delicious meal you've tasted.
That's a great example. By connecting the word to a sensory experience, you're creating a much stronger memory. And it's not just about visual images, right? We can also use emotions, sounds, even smells to create these connections.
Absolutely. The more senses you engage, the more memorable the word will be.
So context is key. What else can we do to improve our word retention?
Well, another common pitfall is information overload. If you try to learn too many new words at once, your brain can get overwhelmed.
It's like trying to stuff a suitcase that's already bursting at the seams. Something's bound to fall out.
Exactly. It's important to find a balance. Learning a few words well is much more effective than trying to learn a ton of words superficially.
So quality over quantity when it comes to vocabulary building.
Absolutely. And finally, we can't forget about the importance of real-life exposure. If you only encounter new words in a textbook or a classroom setting, they're less likely to stick.
That makes sense. We need to hear those words being used in natural contexts, in conversations, in movies, in songs everywhere.
Right. The more you immerse yourself in the language, the more opportunities you'll have to encounter those words in different situations, which reinforces your memory and helps you understand how to use them correctly.
So we've explored some of the key reasons why we forget words. We don't use active recall. We fall prey to the forgetting curve. We learn in isolation. We overload our brains. And we lack real-life exposure.
You've got it. But the good news is each of these pitfalls comes with its own set of solutions.
Okay, so let's shift gears now and delve into the practical stuff. What are some actionable strategies our listeners can use to start remembering and using these elusive English words?
One of the most effective techniques is spaced repetition. It's based on the idea that we need to revisit information at increasing intervals, to move it from our short-term memory to our long-term memory.
So instead of just cramming a bunch of words at once, we should spread out our review sessions.
Exactly. There are even apps and websites that can help you create spaced repetition schedules, so you don't have to worry about keeping track of everything manually.
That sounds great. Are there any other techniques that can help us solidify those words in our memory?
Another powerful technique is to use flashcards. Write the English word on one side of the card and the definition on the other. Then test yourself regularly, trying to recall the definition from the word.
That's a classic technique. But I can see how it would be really helpful for active recall.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to get creative with your flashcards. Add pictures, example sentences, even personal connections that help you remember the word.
So if I'm learning the word serene, I might draw a picture of a calm lake or write down a memory that evokes a feeling of serenity.
Exactly. The more personal and engaging you make the flashcards, the more likely you are to remember the words.
This is making so much sense. It's not just about rote memorization. It's about creating meaningful connections and actively engaging with the words.
You've got it. And that brings us to another important strategy. Make it a point to use a new word immediately after you learn it. Ideally, try to use it within 24 hours.
So don't let it just sit there gathering dust in your mental vocabulary notebook. Use it or lose it right.
Exactly. Say it out loud, write it in a sentence, use it in a conversation, anything to cement that connection in your brain.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes, right? It's all part of the learning process.
Absolutely. In fact, making mistakes can actually help you learn better. When you make a mistake, you're more likely to remember the correct way to use the word in the future.
That's encouraging. It takes the pressure off
Yeah.
and allows you to be more playful and experimental with the language. So we've got spaced repetition, flashcards, immediate use. What else have we got?
Well, another powerful technique is to learn words in chunks or phrases rather than in isolation.
So instead of just learning the word beautiful, I might learn the phrase, a beautiful sunset.
Exactly. Living words in context helps you understand how to use them correctly and makes them more memorable.
That makes sense. It's like learning a dance move. It's easier to learn a sequence of steps than to learn each step in isolation.
Perfect analogy.
It sounds like the key is to find what works for you and to keep things interesting. We don't want to turn vocabulary learning into a chore.
Exactly. And speaking of keeping things interesting, another great strategy is to incorporate your interests into your learning.
So if I'm a big fan of movies, I might focus on learning vocabulary related to film.
That's a great example. Or if you're passionate about cooking, you might learn words related to food and recipes. The more you connect your learning to things you enjoy, the more motivated and engaged you'll be.
I love that. It's all about making language learning relevant to your life. And speaking of real-life application, are there any other practical tips our listeners can use to integrate new words into their daily routines?
One simple but effective technique is to label things around your house with their English names.
So put a sticky note on the table that says table, on the lamp that says lamp.
Exactly. It might seem silly, but it's a great way to passively reinforce those words in your mind. You're constantly seeing them and associating them with the actual objects.
It's like creating an immersive English environment, even if you're just at home.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of reading and listening. Surround yourself with English as much as possible. Read books, magazines, articles online.
Right.
Listen to podcasts, watch movies and TV shows.
It's all about exposure.
Eh.
The more we hear and see these words being used in natural contexts, the better we'll understand them, and the more likely we are to use them ourselves.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to actively engage with what you're reading or listening to. Look up new words, write them down, make flashcards, even try to use them in your own conversations or writing.
So it's not just about passive consumption, it's about active participation.
Exactly. The more you actively work with the language, the better you'll learn it.
This is all so encouraging. It feels like we're giving our listeners a real toolkit for success. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on something that I think is really important: confidence.
Absolutely. Confidence plays a huge role in language learning. If you're afraid to make mistakes, you're less likely to speak up and practice.
And practice is key, right? The more we use the language, the more fluent and confident we become.
Exactly. So how can we build that confidence? Well, one way is to focus on celebrating small victories. Don't get too caught up in perfection. Instead, be proud of yourself for every new word you learn, every conversation you have, every time you push yourself outside of your comfort zone.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Absolutely. And remember, everyone learns at their own pace. Don't compare yourself to others. Focus on your own journey and celebrate your own achievements.
That's such an important message. It's easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others, especially in the age of social media. But language learning is a personal journey, and we need to be kind to ourselves along the way.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. There's a whole community of English learners out there who are going through the same challenges and celebrating the same victories.
It's amazing how connecting with others can boost our motivation and confidence. So as we wrap up this episode, what's one final piece of advice you give to our listeners who are on this journey of mastering English vocabulary?
I'd say embrace the journey. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, to experiment, to have fun with the language. The more you enjoy the process, the more successful you'll be.
That's beautiful advice. And remember, every new word you learn, every conversation you have brings you one step closer to fluency. Keep practicing, stay curious, and never stop exploring the wonderful world of English.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on English Listen and Learn. Until next time.
Let's learn some new vocabularies together. Word amnesia. It means forgetting a word you know while speaking or writing. Example: I had word amnesia during my speech and couldn't remember the right term. Stage fright. It means feeling very nervous or scared before performing in front of people. Example: she got stage fright before her big presentation and forgot what to say. Flown the coop. It means left a place, often suddenly or unexpectedly. Example: by the time the police arrived, the suspect had already flown the coop. Vanished into thin air. It means disappeared completely without a trace. Example: my keys were right here a second ago, but now they've vanished into thin air. Cramming. It means studying a lot in a short time, usually before a test. Example: he spent the whole night cramming for his final exam. Thanks for watching. Until next time.